Good evening. Welcome to Kestryl and Company. On tonight's segment, we're going to be discussing a rather serious topic, that of religious persecution, both through history and in modern times, since this is one of the things that has been affecting the craft community for centuries now. My guests this evening are Joe McGuire, a scholar, and Dan Holgrive, a member of the Coalition for Religious Freedom. Welcome to my circle, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Joe, I understand that you've done quite a lot of historical study on this particular topic.
Well, I've read various works on the burning, what's referred to as the burning times in most literature. And specifically, there usually refers to a time frame from about 1300 to approximately 1700, or about 400 years in the so-called Common Era. However, there's a much earlier version of that where the Christian community was itself persecuted by the so-called pagan community. In point of fact, it was not the pagan community at large that was involved, but the Roman state. The religious persecutions were primarily a political activity done by the Roman authorities to maintain control of society.
In my studies of the historical events of the craft, I've found that that's a rather common denominator, politics being involved with the persecution of religion.
Yeah, that does indeed seem to be the case. What areas do you particularly have an interest in?
Well, the ones that I'm particularly active in myself, of course, are for the modern pagan community, but also with the Native American community. In that, when the whites originally came to this particular continent, they had absolutely no understanding or form of communication with the spirituality of the Native Americans, and that started years of persecution that are still happening now.
Yes, they are, as a matter of fact, not only in the United States, but in Latin America as well.
What are some of the more modern cases that are happening right now?
Well, when you get into the history of modern American religious persecution, I think you get something very different from what Joe was talking about in the early Roman times or the burning times. Because in America we have a history of mass hysteria against religious movements. Probably the most notable is the death of Joseph Smith and the driving of the Mormons westward repeatedly until they actually had to leave what was then the U.S. and go out to Utah and make their own community. We saw a similar period of intense anti-Catholic bigotry and harassment. Of course, there have been periodic problems with anti-Semitism. So there has been, in spite of our religious freedom heritage, a real tradition of mass intolerance and mass antagonism toward any religious group that's perceived as different or unusual, not the way we do things here. And that certainly is manifesting today against the craft in many areas. And not only against the craft, but as one of a whole spectrum of new or unusual religious movements.
Do you find a commonality with the involvement of politics and religion being one of the basis for this?
Politics generally comes in my experience, when there's power involved. And the smallest religious movements often don't have any power. And yet they're often the ones that are persecuted. It's more of a scapegoat phenomena than a political phenomena. People want an excuse for why society isn't the way they think it ought to be, or the way they think it was in their grandparents' time. And so they say, oh, it's those people there, they're different, they're changing things. We've got to get rid of them. Now, politicians can play on this, certainly, but the underlying motive isn't political, it's more sociological, I think.
In discussing the burning times, which of course is still a very sore subject for many people in the craft, Let's talk a little bit about how that originally started, because there are a lot of people who don't really know that it was actually started by mistake.
Yes, as a matter of fact. The book which has primarily been the source of Protestant and Catholic denominations was called Malleus Maleficarum, I believe, or The Witch's Hammer. And it was put together by two German monks, and in those days you had to have the official blessing of the senior member of the church in your area, specifically an archbishop or a cardinal. They had to sign off on any document that was published. Publishing was a new thing in the 1200s, 1300s. Books were now being produced at fantastic levels that they couldn't be before because of the printing press. Well, if you wanted to get a book published, you had to have that signature. Well, these two monks didn't do that. They forged it. And that forgery was never challenged. The book itself is designed as a manual to teach witch hunters how to go about the job of extracting confessions, conducting interrogations, and the general phenomena that are supposedly associated with those who are witches.
Which are basically extremely hideous personal injury type.
You have to remember that in those days, the use of torture was an integral part of interrogation processes, and they're quite, rather grim. Spanish boot, thumb screws, iron maidens. One of the more favorite one was a little beastie called the strapido, which dislocated arms from sockets and a few other things, as well as the rack.
And one of the more famous one that's been brought about is, of course, the Iron Maiden, which is not at all pleasant. There are still today people within various religious communities. Mr. Holgarvey mentioned the anti-Semitism that still happens today. I just today received in one of the pagan newsletters news of some rather hideous things happening, people getting shot at down in Florida on their own private property. What can people do if something like this happens to them?
Well, you have to ask, we may have to break this down a little more carefully into which kind of something like. But let's take the simple example. Someone is shot at, someone is the victim of a crime. If you're the victim of a crime, you go to the authorities. And you make sure you can prove you went to the authorities. Number one, you've got to make sure that the crime is reported. But it's not enough to go down and tell the police. Make sure you give the police a written statement and you have a copy. Because one of the problems with being an unpopular religion is that you don't always get the same treatment. I was listening to Joe here about how they forged the signature and nobody cared. Well, this is a common experience, I find, that if an unpopular religious group did something like that, it'd be a federal case. But when the people who are opposed to it do something like that, well, it was just a technicality. And so you have to be prepared to prove every step what you did, that the complaints were filed, that you made timely notice, that you just keep a paper record of everything you're doing. Because you may have to prove at some point that this really happened and really was reported when the police say, oh, well, gee, that's not what we heard.
Yeah,
The page is missing from the police blotter.
Yeah, I've found in several people across the country reporting incidents of their outdoor temples being desecrated or something like this. The response time from the police was very slow, if it came at all, and that reports were lost quite often. What about in the case of someone being discriminated against, say, in an employment situation?
Well, employment discrimination is, on the one hand, absolutely illegal. On the other hand, there's next to nothing you can do about it. Unless the employer is so sloppy that he somewhere writes down, I didn't hire him because he was a Wiccan. The easiest way to understand this is to look at the Civil Rights Bill that's now pending in Congress. The civil rights organizations are pushing desperately for a bill which will enable them to prove discrimination on the basis of statistical results. Because even where you have real discrimination against blacks, and people know that there's discrimination against blacks, it's almost impossible to prove an individual case. And it's been so hard that they're going back to Congress and they're saying, don't make us prove that John Smith was discriminated against. Say it's good enough that we can show that the percentage of blacks is too low. This will never work for Wiccans or for Krishnas or Scientologists or any other small religious group, because they can't show the statistics of how many there are in the area and how many there should be there. You've got to be up 5 or 10% of the population before the statistical method will work.
And because we're still so far underground, we aren't able to do those proving factors at this point.
Even if you could register everybody and show that you were a solid 0.5% of the population, that's too small to be statistically significant. How do you show that IBM isn't hiring 0.5% of its employees as Wiccans? You got to get a higher number before you can even begin to use the method.
I think the only way to really help heal some of the things that have happened to this is not only to be aware of it in today's society, but to study where it came from and study the patterns. And I think that the saying everything that goes around comes around is very accurate. If in the Roman Empire, the pagans or the pantheists started out persecuting the Christians, well, the Christians got their turn a couple of centuries later. Some of the more common historical events, besides, of course, the original part of the Inquisition, of course, the Nazi concentration camps against Judaism was also a very strong factor, and as some of the literature within the Christian church, much of the Old Testament coming from many of the writings within the Jewish church, I find it interesting and very disturbing that people are basically fighting against their own roots.
Well, yeah, because you have to remember that if you look where the words such as Jehovah come from, which is what most folks say is the name of God, you're actually looking at the name of a volcano or mountain fire god from the Caucasus Mountains.
Like Yahweh.
Yes, exactly.
That's something that we may get a few letters on.
I'm
People
sure you
saying
will.
automatically, oh, they're just trying to validate their faith by using the names and
No, there's more than adequate scholarship to back that up. If you go into the records of archaeological digs and studies of languages and of that nature, you can find this information. I mean, it's there. I mean, it's not something that somebody just dreamed up yesterday for the heck of it.
I find it interesting that in amongst the interviews that I've been doing because of the show, I find that there are a lot of people who are not very well read about the roots of their religion. For instance, I was speaking with one young man, and he asked me where I was getting some of my information about the life of Jesus Christ, because the only book ever written on the life of Jesus Christ was the Christian Bible.
Yeah.
But the Book of Mormon has also been written. There are several historians that have put together the pieces of his travels, and so it's not really the only book ever written. What are some of the places that people can look for support in modern problems? I know that the ACLU is one, but your organization is one that I wasn't really familiar with until recently.
Yes. Well, there are quite a number of organizations. The Coalition for Religious Freedom does not represent people in court, but we are happy to talk to people, try to give them referrals. Occasionally, we've been able to negotiate some things. without going to court, just to clear up, you know, so a nice letter says, do you realize you can't do this under the Constitution? Oh, sorry. A lot of times, some of the most egregious cases of religious discrimination can be cleared up merely by letting the attorney for the people who are doing the discriminating know what's going on. And they'll call them up right away and say, no, no, you can't do that. It's just, there's ignorance. We were involved in a case recently involving a young Wiccan woman where it was a college, a technical college, and the administration, the dean, had begun doing some things that were just inexcusable. And this poor woman felt just like the whole world had fallen in on her head.
This was the case at Georgia Tech, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it wasn't, and I prefer not to say where it was.
That's fine. That's fine.
Because it cleared up very nicely when we pointed out that they couldn't do this, and they said, oh, well, we never did that. So a lot of times things will straighten out as soon as you get it, as soon as you get some communication going about what's going on here. This ties back to people and how people are. People tend to believe that those kind of people don't have the same rights I do. And so, you know, these are not necessarily evil people. They're nice people. They love their mother. They take care of their kids. But they just, it's like in the South a few years back, you know, well, blacks are different. Blacks aren't the same as us. And people went through their whole life thinking this way. Well, now people think, you know, those guys, new religions, unusual religions aren't the same as us. But if you can break through that and get them to look at what the law is, a lot of times that opposition will collapse.
That's one of the things that we're trying to do with our show, is to educate people as to what it is we really do, because the ignorances are a lot of what has brought about so many misconceptions. I find that one of my students very recently was going through a divorce situation, was trying to get custody of her children, and her husband immediately brought up the fact, oh, well, she's a Wiccan, so she couldn't possibly be a good mother. How does someone fight something like that? Bringing their elders into court?
Well, yeah. Custody battles are a very tricky case. And in fact, custody battles are one of the worst problems for religious freedom nationwide. Not just for Wiccans, but any kind of group. And particularly if one parent is in the group and the other parent has left the group. Because then it's not just, oh, well, they're different. It's, oh, I used to be in there. Let me tell you how horrible it was. I got to get my kids out. In fact, there's one organization, the Cult Awareness Network, which has set up a little specialty in helping people attack religious groups in these custody battles. Even to having, working with people who will go grab the children from the parent who has custody, take them across state lines, and then run into the courtroom somewhere else with the other parent and try to get the custody changed over. It's a very nasty area.
Is that legal?
Well, no, but when you get into the courtroom and the kids have had their minds filled with this, 2 or 3 weeks of being told how terrible the group their mother's in is, and then if you can snow the judge at that point, he issues a new order, you're in a new state with a new order, what's the mother going to do?
Children, unfortunately, I'm finding, because they love their parents so much, it's very easy for one parent, when they're angry at the other, to use their children against the other parent, to not necessarily brainwash, but influence the child in an unfair manner. And children, until they've reached 12, 13, 14 years old, when they're old enough to make their own cognizant decisions, they can look at situations and know for sure what it is that's going on around them. I think it's very unfair that they should be used in such a way. The Salem witch trials began with the word of a child who didn't like her nanny. Mm-hmm. And because of that, several thousand people, not witches, not Wiccans, just people, died and were burned because of that. And
Not in Salem.
not in Salem, just Salem, but children are very important, and in some cases they can give us insight. But it is not at all fair for parents in any situation, be it religious or legal or whatever, to use their children against one another. They were created in love, and they should be raised in love.
And yet this is one of the real areas where religions are at a disadvantage. Because if you can get a social worker to say, oh, well, that group has, those practices aren't good for the child, you can legitimize all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of social workers who'll say that. It depends on the area, which groups they're against. In the South, you probably get social workers who'll say that about Wiccans. But up in the Northeast and the more cosmopolitan areas, there are social workers who'll say that about fundamentalist Christian groups.
Yes. Well, I think there are things in every community that can be harmful to the children and twisted every which way, depending on what they are. But as I said before, one of the purposes of Kestryl and Company is to dispel a lot of that so that they don't think that we're going to take the babies out and boil them in our pots to make candles and stuff. We don't do that. That's not our aim.
Which, by the way, is one of the things that the Romans accused the Christian community of doing in the course of their persecutions of the Christians.
Isn't it interesting how the words of the persecuted come back to be the words of the persecutor?
Yes, because when the so-called burning times occurred, those were among the same charges that were brought against the pagan community. And you have to remember that most of what happened occurred in cities and in village contexts, not in the isolated farms. That's where most of the people who stayed craft, who stayed, true to the old ways, lived. That's why pagan means country dweller. Heathen means someone who lives on the heath.
I think that the main things that we like to stress in tonight's show is that before you speak against someone, learn about them. And if there is some kind of persecution, be it religious or any other kind, racial or whatever, that's happening to you, go to the authorities and investigate what you can do for yourself. This is very important. We are trying to stress the similarities between ourselves, not the differences. There are many, many differences between people. And the more we stress the differences, the wider the rifts between us become. If we can stress our similarities and find out that we're all really going about for the same thing, then we can start bringing the harmony that the world deserves. Thank you for joining us tonight on Kestryl and Company. Join us again, won't you? Blessed be.